Welcome to our second education discussion for kinship families. The subject for the discussion today is accessing support at secondary schools. These are the things that we're going to cover in the presentation today. The transition to high school triggers feelings of loss and brings up some of the threat responses that maybe we first saw when our children came to live with us. This means that children who were relatively settled at primary school and who did quite well are suddenly all at sea when they arrive at secondary school. They don't have the same secure connections to the adults that they did at primary, because it takes time for these connections with adults to form. And I think the sheer number of adults and the number of children that they don't know at secondary school, again, that kind of heightens the survival instincts in children. And I suppose that the move to high school brings up memories of other big changes too, like perhaps when they moved in to live with your family. By the time children arrive at high school, another difficulty is that the adults around them kind of expect them to have a degree of control over how they behave, because after all, they've been in school for 7 years. But this is a really big issue for children whose needs have not been fully diagnosed. So sometimes we find that trauma masks some of the neurodevelopmental conditions, like, for example, if your child was exposed to prenatal alcohol, then it might be that the effects of the alcohol are long lasting, and they kind of play out in children's behaviour, but not because the children are being bad, but because there are legitimate difficulties that have been caused by the alcohol. And sometimes we find that children's anxiety is covered up by aggression or by rudeness. And again, where we find out that fetal alcohol syndrome is present, then that can make a really big difference to, what we find is that children's ages kind of fluctuate. So it might be that their physical age is 13, but they and they're able to talk really well, and it sounds like they're really well developed and they're really chatty and they come across as very articulate. But when we look at how well they receive language and how well they process instructions, we might find that their ability to do that is maybe the same kind of ability as of like a much younger child. So these different ages that children can have, we refer to that as a spiky profile. That can be quite challenging when children get to secondary school. And it's difficult because we kind of treat all children the same, really, don't we? We expect children to sit alongside their classmates who maybe don't have some of these difficulties. And we've got to keep in mind that those different developmental stages that our children might be at. And we also have to keep in mind the different processing types, the different neurodevelopmental processing types. And some children who arrive at secondary school, they still need adults to help regulate their emotions. They might look older, but their behaviour is still immature, and they need support with that. And then, of course, there's the teenage years. They're notoriously tricky for all children, because children are branching out, they're trying to be independent. Suddenly their peers take on even more significance than they did before. And at the same time, children are doing what they're supposed to do. They're carving out their own identity. But this can take on extra challenges for children where they're missing maybe large pieces of history. So it might be that they don't fully understand their early life experiences or why they've ended up living the way that they do, why they're not living with their birth parents. And it might be that there are kind of attachment issues that go alongside some of our children. It's not straightforward for children. And there are maybe triggers as well in the curriculum. So, if children have got all these things going on in their head and they suddenly go into a science class and they're studying genetics, or they're studying a novel where there's a really tricky seen that is maybe very similar to something that's happened to them, or they're learning all about family vocabulary and it brings home to them that there's a person in their life that they don't see. All of these things can take up space in a person's brain and maybe make it a little bit more difficult for them on the day-to-day secondary school front. And if we put all of that together, and we also throw in that sometimes children feel uncomfortable being their authentic self. So they might mask in school, they might try to behave in a particular way in school so that they fit in, but by trying to behave in that way that they think is what's expected of them, it puts enormous strain and stress on them, and therefore you see this kind of explosive behaviour when they come home from school. And we know too that if you have really good support from school, if teachers work with you and they work with children, then children are going to do really well. But we also know from our helplines that there is a gap here, and that sometimes families don't feel supported, that maybe secondary staff, or not, that staff in general haven't fully understood the needs of their children, or that their children haven't been, their needs haven't been diagnosed fully. And that can be really difficult if staff expectations are unrealistic for what a child is able to manage in a particular moment. And all children need to feel safe and cared for and have a sense of belonging to be in the best place for learning. If they don't feel those things and they feel under threat, they're going to mask their behaviour by acting out or complying. Sometimes children's behaviour becomes the focus of attention rather than their learning progress. And if you think your child is struggling to cope with the academic side of things in school, then you need to get in touch with school and ask to speak to a support for learning teacher or a guidance teacher, and ask school to do some assessments to see if there are reasons for your child's difficulty. The additional support for learning legislation requires schools to make reasonable adjustments for pupils with additional support needs, but the law doesn't say how much or what type of support each learner should get. Instead, it says that their support has to be adequate and efficient and based on individual needs. What reasonable adjustments and adequate and efficient means different things to different people, but the starting point is always what does your individual child need? Each child is looked at on an individual basis, and the starting point is to pick up the phone and speak to the support for learning teacher or the pastoral lead. The pastoral lead would be the guidance teacher, or maybe sometimes they're called the pupil support leader, and ask them to help. And just to give you a wee idea of the different types of support that might be on offer in terms of learning and teaching, that means that the teachers might look at different ways to teach your child. They might use things like, sometimes we call them social stories. It's really an information story that tries to explain to a child how you might go about doing something. They might use a specific reading scheme. For example, if your child is dyslexic, or they might try a particular approach. So if your child is struggling with reading and writing at secondary level, they might do something called Fresh Start. They might use a zones of regulation, which looks at supporting social and emotional behaviour at secondary level. They might just use language in a particular way. So sometimes children do much better when the language is really clear and it's very literal. They might get more time to do something, or they might get to go to a particular place at break or lunch, or they might have a mentor or a buddy. So there's lots of different things that that school staff can do that might come under learning and teaching supports. In terms of support from other people, it might be an educational psychologist gives the school some advice about things that they could do to support your child, or it might be that another service like an occupational therapist or a speech and language therapist does some assessments and offers the school some guidance about things that they could do. very often it might come down to things like break the tasks down into small chunks, use some kind of visual aid to help the child remember. It might be bringing in a support for learning assistant that the child can check in with, or giving them a checklist of equipment and helping them to organise their self, or even like small group supports as well. In terms of resources, it might be things like giving the child a tablet to work on, or a computer, giving them coloured overlays to, sometimes we would do that if a child has got some visual stress. We might change the colour of their paper. We might give them headphones or ear defenders, or pencil grips, or we might give them stools to sit on that kind of wobble and give them a wee bit more feedback in terms of movement. We might give them a pass where they can get out of class early so that they're moving from class to class when the corridors are not particularly busy. But all of these things are things that come into play for a particular child, depending on what that child needs. Some of these supports will work really well for one child and another child will hate them. So we've got to find out something that works for your child. And the other thing to remember is that those terms, reasonable, efficient, and adequate, are going to vary depending on the number of pupils in a school, the types of need the school are dealing with, the type of building that you're in, or maybe things like staff illness. All of these things are going to be factors in what the school can reasonably manage at any one time. I've already said this, the very first thing to do if you've got a problem is speak to school, the guidance teacher, the deputy head, the support for learning teacher, and probably you would start that GIRFEC process. So GIRFEC is getting it right for every child. You would ask the school to have a meeting for your child. Care experienced children are presumed to have additional support needs. They should be part of the GIRFEC process, and they should have regular planning meetings, and regular might mean only once a year. And you might have more of those meetings if your child has complex needs or is in crisis. If you don't have a regular meeting, then ask for one. And on this next slide, it kind of talks you through the Shinari indicators. So safe, healthy, achieving, nurtured, active, respected, responsible, included. These are things that at your GIRFEC meeting, you and the staff would look at, and you would look to see which areas your child is strong in, and which areas your child needs a bit of extra support in. In those areas that your child needs more support in, you would work with the school to come up with a plan of how you in school can support your child in that particular area. And at these meetings, the most important part of it really is what the child thinks. So the child's views are very much the centre of that meeting. And you'll look at the strengths, you'll look at any concerns for the child, what school is doing about it at the moment, what supports are in place at the moment, and then what you could do going forward. And it should look at the things that are going well and the things that are concerns at school and at home. So if you need a bit of extra support at home, then schools should be looking to see what they can do to support the child in that family context as well. Personal learning planning is for all children and young people, regardless of whether or not they've got any additional support needs. So different schools have different formats and approaches, but at a pupil progress meeting or consultation, you discuss what your child is learning and what evidence school have got and what progress they've made, and you plan for the next steps in their learning. But if your child has got additional support needs, then local authorities use something called staged intervention to identify the different level of support that your child needs to meet their needs. And the staged intervention models vary a little bit between local authorities. Generally, stage 1 means that Any additional support is given by the class teacher in class. Stage 2 generally means that support is provided by somebody else in school. So it might be somebody like a support for learning teacher, or a pupil support assistant, or a guidance teacher, or careers advisor. Somebody else in school is doing a little bit of extra with your child to support them. Stage 3 usually means that there is another agency involved. So it might be somebody is coming into school from speech and language, or an educational psychologist is coming in and doing a bit of work with your child, or an observation of your child. Or that may be there's an alternative curriculum option in place for your child. So sometimes a child might go every Tuesday, they might go out to a different venue for a lesson. So in primary schools, we use forest school places, or some children go off to a farm for activities, and then they come back and they do that instead of going to the lesson that the rest of the class are going to. So that would maybe be something that you would look at as a stage 3 intervention. Stage 4 might be that your child goes to a base for a period of time, and stage 5 might be that you go to a kind of special school. So essentially what's happening is each stage, the level of need is increasing, and the level of support needed is increasing. The child's plan we've already talked about on the previous slide. So that's the getting it right for every child, where you and school work together to meet your child's needs. You would produce a plan at those meetings, and the action points that come from that meeting are built into the minutes, and they generate a plan. And for children with complex needs, this might be a multi-agency meeting where the professionals that are at the meeting feed into the education plan for your child. Some schools have something called an additional support plan, where schools record the adjustments and the supports and the interventions that are needed to help your child progress in school. And these adjustments might be about being flexible with how teaching happens. They might be about, coming in slightly later, leaving slightly earlier, so that your child is more settled to learning. An individual education plan is a written document that outlines the steps to be taken to help a child or young person with additional support needs achieve specific learning outcomes. And you can find out more about IEPs on the Enquire website. In fact, you can find out about all of these plans on the Enquire website. They've got guides. If a child is at a very different level of learning to the rest of the class, and they require a substantial change to class learning, and maybe specialists are involved, then that child is likely to be on an IEP. Often this is when a child is at a different level of learning to the rest of the class, so they might still be operating at early level when everybody else in their class is on second level work, for example. At secondary school, there's likely to be more variation in the levels of groups. Secondary schools often set children by ability level, so it might be that there's a particular group of children that are working at the same level as your child, and if that's the case, then an IEP wouldn't be needed because you would have a group plan. A coordinated support plan is a statutory plan used to identify and ensure provision of services for children with complex or multiple additional support needs. And the criteria that exists in local authorities is quite strict for these. If your child has needs that have a significant negative effect on their school education and are likely to last for at least a year, and they need support from a local authority and at least one other non-education service or agency, then you would meet the criteria for a CSP, a coordinated support plan. And the government suggests that all looked after children are considered for a CSP, but you still have to meet those criteria in order to qualify. I really love this slide. Learning is for life. Please keep it in mind. Our children have been through an awful lot in their lives. They've got very busy brains and nervous systems. They're progressing through their learning. They're being judged alongside people who've not got any barriers to learning, and whose maybe life experiences have been really uneventful. So your child might benefit from a bit of flexibility in timescales and approaches, but we can still have high expectations and they can still have a positive destination, but perhaps the timescale needs to be slightly different for them than it is for other people. But support is available for care experienced children up to the age of 26. There is no wrong path in education. This is a checklist for educators. It's on the kinship.scot website in our education section. It was developed for school staff, and it basically is a list of things that they should really consider when it comes to support for your child. So it's got a little bit at the beginning about care experience. It's got a link to a resource called Let's Learn Together, which looks at why some children might have more difficulty in school than others. And then it's got just a list, like you see on the screen there, of kind of tick boxes of different things that over the years people have either shared with me as good practice, or it's come up in talking to families that these are needs. So for example, that first one says, we need to understand what the triggers are for children in secondary school. So if your child is having difficulty with a particular teacher or a particular subject, then has that teacher read your child's education file? Is there something in your child's background that's making it more difficult for your children to cope in that particular class? And it might be something like the teacher's accent, or it might be something to do with the subject matter that's triggering for your child. What else is there? There's the kind of planning things. In terms of transition supports, so moving from class to class can be quite difficult for some people. So here are a wee list of suggestions about things that you could do. Teachers can give a young person a job to do to distract them. They can give them a job to do that provides what we call sensory feedback. So we often talk about weighted things, helping kids to be a bit more grounded. Go to our kinship.scot website and have a look at this checklist and see if you think it would be useful for you. There's also supports at the end, to links to videos, links to resources, and there's also links for you in terms of support for your family that might exist. In terms of how support works in secondary school, the number one rule is follow the GIRFIC process. Get the planning meeting in place and support your child to say what it is that's going on for them. How do they feel? What doesn't work in school? What would make them feel better? What would work better for them? Because their views are the most important in that meeting. The second bit of this is a bit trickier to get right, because often our children's needs don't fit neatly into boxes or systems. We know that they need strong support and caring relationships in school. And we know that sometimes, even when we do those things, something triggering might come along and upset them, and that trauma responses don't fit with social norms. So we need to apply creative thinking and a bit of flexibility to our solutions, and just think outside the box a wee bit to see if we can find something that works for the child. And remember, again, by the time we get to high school, we might be, if your child's got increasing difficulty at high school, then we need to look beyond trauma, and we need to look at the neurodevelopmental causes. Don't just assume that any difficulties come down to trauma. We need to kind of dig below that, particularly when we think about maybe prenatal alcohol exposure, because we know that that's a really difficult thing to talk about. People don't really talk about drinking during pregnancy, but the impact of alcohol is long lasting. If we are following the GIRFEC process, which is what local authorities should do, then we're also following that staged intervention process. And this lets us build up an evidence profile of our children's needs and evidence of where support is or isn't working. So as long as you're doing that, and school is doing that, you should be able to keep moving through the staged intervention process. And if at any point you think school are failing in their duty to provide adequate support, then there's a process that you can follow for that. There are some issues that maybe take on greater significance in secondary school. But again, I'd come back to the fact that all supports need to come back to the child. And I know that the supports that local authorities might offer, for example, if your child is absent from school, they can't necessarily replicate the same amount of support that you would have if you were in school. So it might be that your child can access learning a couple of hours a week rather than the however many hours they're supposed to be in for a full week. But there are other alternatives as well. So ESCOIL is an online school with people that teach lessons in real time. It's not for everyone because you still have to get yourself to a computer screen and take part in the lessons, but schools can refer to the ESCOIL programme. Young Minds is an excellent website for young people if you're looking for support with mental health. There are also mentoring options that exist in support agencies outside of school. So you might be able to either bring in CAMS to provide some support or bring in a community-based programme to offer mentoring support, like MCR Pathways is one that exists across the nation. Or it might be that you're looking for kinship support. So if you contact the Kinship helpline, we are in the process of developing enhanced supports for kinship that follow the PATH model that we have in other parts of the organisation. And PATH stands for Psychological and Therapy Hub. And again, you know, if things like contact with family members is something that's causing you concern, then contact the Kinship helpline and ask what supports you might be able to tap into as a family through our organisation. Maybe speak to staff about being vigilant about social media, monitoring or ICT monitoring, but make sure you tap into the supports that we can offer as an organisation. Most of the day-to-day responsibility for arranging and providing support for your child lies with the school. But if your child needs more or different support to what the school could provide, then it's the local authority that's responsible for making sure that they get the help they need. And the local authority can also ask services like health or social work for help too. By law, education authorities must identify, provide for, and review additional support needs of pupils. But it doesn't specify how they have to do this. So it might be that the local or the school will do an assessment of need for your child, and that will grow out of that GIRFEC system, those planning meetings that you have. So together you would look at what is it that the child needs and what supports are you putting in place for that? And are there any other assessments that you need to carry out? If problems do continue, then the advice would be ask for a meeting to address your concerns as a kind of first step. And maybe take along somebody with you as well. Maybe take along an advocate, take along a family friend, somebody who could provide a bit of emotional support for you, somebody who could act as a neutral voice, somebody that could take notes for you, somebody that will prompt you if you forget something, and prepare what you want to say in advance. We've got some help sheets that might help you to do that, but you can also get in touch with the helpline and ask to have a conversation with me, and I'll help you to plan out some things ahead of your meeting. NVR stands for non-violent resistance, and Haim Omar is one of the proponents of NVR, and he wrote a book called Courageous Parents, Being a Good Anchor for Your Child. And he had a wee chapter in that book all about how to talk with your child's school. And he made 5 kind of recommendations in that chapter. One was be honest and ask for help. When you're bringing up an issue, then be careful to avoid any sort of blame, because sometimes when we say there's a problem, we automatically assume that somebody must be at fault for that. So he says, or he suggests, emphasizing the fact that you're in it together. You know, if we do this together, let's look at this together. What can we do together? Number 2, he says, respect the teacher's need to support the whole class. So again, remember that it's not just your child that's there, that the teacher, particularly in secondary school, the teacher's got, 20 or 30 kids in front of them, and every hour they've got a different set of 20 or 30 kids in front of them, and that's a lot of people to see in any one day. So try and kind of keep that in mind, that it's important to help your child but still have time and space to help the other people as well. Number 3, he suggests positive involvement. So at the very first opportunity, make sure that you're open to knowing the good and the bad. And number 4, be honest about the problems. So again, sometimes if we can see our child is having a lot of difficulty, then we want to go and we want to protect them. But he says, opt for something neutral. We understand that there are difficulties here and we're doing everything that we can to help. And he suggests that we speak really openly about the problems that we're having too. So we create this feeling of being open, and it encourages everybody to work together. And number 5, address any problems. So if you do fall out with school staff, then try to make up, essentially. If that happens, speak to the head teacher or look for advocacy or mediation to try to bring the 2 sides together again, because you do need to be on the same side as school if you want to get the best out of school for your child. There are lots of services that you can approach outside of school who might be able to help. So there's CAMS, there's social work, there's kinship services, there's the support that we can offer, and then there are local and national organisations that might be able to help as well. So Who Cares Scotland offer community supports for children and families, Children First, Bernardo's, and then there are MCR pathways I mentioned already, and then there are other kind of local community groups that might be able to help as well. And on the kinship.scot website, there's a brilliant link to services that are organised by local authority. Although the Scottish education system is based on the fact that if your child has a need, then school is supposed to look for ways to meet that need and support it. You don't need a diagnosis to access support. It's not without its failings, and if your child has exclusions in their background, then use the exclusions as evidence to show that your child needs more support. If you're looking to complain, then there are various places that you can go to for extra support. Enquire have information that will lay out the process for raising concerns with school. Usually local authority websites have policies and procedures on them, so you can check against these to see if you've got grounds for a complaint. And if you can't reach an agreement with the local authority, then you might wish to make an appeal. The ASN Tribunal is an independent and expert body that considers different types of appeals and disagreements about additional support needs. So for example, decisions about CSPs, placing requests, planning for children leaving school, disability, all of these things, the tribunal will consider the arguments and evidence put to them and decide what should happen next. It's really helpful if you think you do have cause for complaint, then keep evidence. Keep your emails, your reports, because these will be really helpful. Govern law also provide legal representation, in particular education cases. If you'd like any more information about any of the things in this presentation, then please do contact me. If you'd like to book an education consultation, then you can either contact the Kinship helpline or contact me at paula.gilhooly@adoptionuk.org.uk.